Bootstrap 3 relied almost exclusively on pixels as the primary unit of measure. However, in Bootstrap 4, you'll find that pixels are used for some things, but they've moved on to Rems for many other things, especially in regards to fonts and typefaces. So what's the fundamental difference between a pixel, an M, and a Rem? Well, that's not an easy question to answer, unfortunately. An oversimplified answer will include something like the fact that pixels are absolute values, but M's and Rems are relative. All right, so that is true, but it really doesn't explain why that matters. And so to start off with, a pixel is 1/96th of an inch, or rather, let me start that over again. A pixel is 1/96th of an in. And in may or may not be a real inch depending on other factors related to a display. Okay. In print, it's different. You use points, and points are always the same size. But when you're working with pixels, a pixel may be a 1/96th of an inch depending on the dots per inch in your screen. Okay. So if you have a 96 DPI, then yes, 1/96th of an inch would represent 1 pixel. But if you're at a 300 DPI, then it becomes much less than that. Okay. Well, at any rate, whenever you ask for a specific pixel size as a web developer on a web page, then you're asking, you're saying that basically you need a specific physical size regardless of other factors that might typically be used to determine the readability and the accessibility of the typeface on that given device. So an M is a relative unit of measure, and it allows the device to decide on the actual physical size of the typeface for presentation to the user to make it more accessible to them. So it gives the device latitude to use a size that makes sense for that unique device's display features. Pixels are generally considered to be bad practice whenever you're working with font sizes as a web developer because it forces the device that you're using to view the web page on to use a very strict, specific pixel size. And a device manufacturer might have already predetermined that a good default font size for readability whenever you're using their device is whatever, 12, 16, 18 pixels. But whenever the web designer comes in and says, no, I want it to be 14 pixels, then the device will usually defer to whatever the web page is asking for, whatever it's demanding to use, and will affect the overall accessibility and the readability of that page as a result. So pixels are not inherently evil, and they still have their usages, and Bootstrap has not completely abandoned them. However, generally whenever you're working with type and fonts on the web, it's now considered a best practice to avoid defining specific font sizes, but rather allow a given operating system or device or even a browser to define what a good default size is, and then merely use that as a starting point to determine the size of everything else relative to that decision. So web developers can use that default size of whatever the operating system or the device or the browser chose as a good baseline to then resize everything else based on it, relative to it. Okay, so that's where the M comes in. If the default font size of the web browser is 16 pixels, then 1M equals 16 pixels. If the device says that the default size should be 12 pixels, then 1M equals 12 pixels. All right, and then that might help us as web developers resize other things on our web page relative to that baseline, to that default size, to that 1 EM measurement. After all, that's kind of the entire premise of building responsive websites, is to make it easily accessible regardless of the form factor, right? So why then did Bootstrap decide to change from pixels in version 3 to using Rems in some cases in version 4? Well, there was actually a lot of pressure on Bootstrap to move away from pixels. And so then they investigated the use of Ems. The problem with Ems in web development, as they're currently implemented in most web browsers, is that they have one nasty side effect, and that's compound growth. And to kind of demonstrate that, well, while I'm here, let me just illustrate that. You can see the that in Bootstrap version 3 that everything is defined in terms of true pixels. However, that same grid as we see it here in the version 4 alpha documentation, you can see that they've changed the gutter width to a 1.875 rem, which still probably works out to be about the same. However, again, the definition is in rem, not in strict pixels. Okay, so I just wanted to illustrate that before we move on here. And I want to talk about the difference between Ems and Rems. So to do that, I'm going to actually add a new HTML page called ems2rems.html so that we can kind of talk about this. We're not going to use our template here. Instead, what we're going to do is just create some content, and it will demonstrate the problem with Ems and how Rems actually relieve that issue. So here in a paragraph, I'm just going to say version 0, and then I'm going to move on to divs, and I'm going to do a series of enclosed divs. So here we have 3 sets of divs that are all nested inside of each other. Inside of the first div, I'm going to add some typeface or some content, just call it version 1. Inside the next one, I'll type in version 2, and inside the third one, I'll call this version 3. All right, and here, just to make it consistent, we'll do that. All right, so now what I'm going to do is go up here and add a style. And, well, first of all, let's just see what our page looks like as we're getting started here. So all the fonts are the same size. I think that's really the main takeaway. And now let's go ahead and apply some styling. So I'm going to add a style to style up div tags. So here we go with a div, and I'm going to set the font size of div tags to 1.5 EM. And you'll see now what the inherent problem is with using Ems as we rerun our page. You can see that the original font size is still represented in version 0 because we merely used a paragraph tag around that. So that's what, probably 12, maybe 14, maybe 16 points. But then every div tag will look to its parent to decide what its size should be. So the first div tag is going to say, okay, my size should be 1.5 of my parent, and my parent is defined by the browser, the root, which would be the HTML tag. And I'll show you how we'll know that for sure here in just a moment. And so if version 0 here is 14 points, or let's say 16 because it's easier to do the math, 16 then plus 0.5 would be 8. So I should be 24 pixels in size. Now version 2 is going to say, well, I should be 1.5 Ems, so I should be 1.5 times my parent. My parent was 24 pixels. That means I should be 24 plus 12. I should be 36 pixels. And then version 3 says, okay, well, I should be 1.5 Ems, and my parent was 36. So 36 plus 18, I should be 54 pixels. All right. And so that's why we see this ever growing size of our fonts. So we can remedy this pretty easily, and we'll do that in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to just show you that we can change the baseline by doing something we should never do, and that is to set, to override the base font size for the entire document using a specific pixel size like so. All right. Now, you'll see how this affects the document. if you'll notice, not only is version 0 larger, but then these versions are compounding out of control. But I just wanted to point out the fact that we have at this point set the root size ourselves, and we should never do that. Otherwise, we're taking it out of the hands of the device, out of the manufacturer who decided what the correct size, what the best size would be. So let me go ahead and comment that out. But I just wanted to show you how that worked, because that's an important consideration. To fix this issue, what we'll do is switch from Ems to Rems. So let me, for the sake of posterity, just copy and paste or cut and paste that other div there, and I'm going to change to Rems. So I just pasted in the div and used an R instead of just an EM. So we're working with Rems now. And now we'll rerun the application, and you can see that each of the div tags text are 1.5, approximately 1.5, the size of version 0 defined inside of the paragraph tag. So a rem is basically giving us the features of an M, but it's removing the problem with compounding sizing. So the R stands for root. So a root M, we're pointing only at the root size. And just to illustrate this one more time, I'll go ahead and reset the root size to 28. And you'll see that everything gets larger, but it's still all relative to the root that we set to be 28 pixels. Okay. Let's go ahead and get that back out there. All right. So rem is short for root element. And I may have hinted that the R in rem was actually for relative, but it's not. The R is for root, meaning that you can now define items relative to the root element, otherwise known as the HTML element, okay? And so this takes the notion of compounding out of the equation, because everything is relative only to the root, not to its parent, like we saw here, all right? So in Bootstrap 4, they'll use rems for things like padding and margin. They'll use things for resizing the headers, and as well as those new display classes that we'll look at soon. And so generally, this is seen as a positive move because it will still allow the device or the browser, the operating system, to specify the default size, and then it will allow web designers to design relative to those defaults. Okay. All right. So hopefully that cleared up the use of pixels versus Ems and Rems. And now we'll just start looking at more classes from here on out in Bootstrap. We'll see you there. Thanks.